They say good fences make good neighbors. But in the high deserts of Arizona, where the sun bleeds across the mountains and the silence is heavy enough to feel, a fence isn't just wood and wire, it's a declaration of war. I was standing in my own front yard, the heat of the afternoon sun prickling the back of my neck, when I heard the screech of tires. Not the slow, respectful roll of a local who knows how to treat a dirt road, but the aggressive, entitled skid of someone who thinks they own the world. He stepped out of that pristine white SUV, not a speck of dust on it, looking at our 5-acre lot like it was a stain on his shoe. He didn't say hello. He didn't offer a hand. He just pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the bumper of my old truck and screamed, "That's 9 inches over the line. If it's not moved by sunset, I'm having it towed." He thought he was taking 9 inches of my pride. He had no idea that by the time I was done, I'd be taking 20 feet of his soul. Welcome back to Saga of Hearts, where we dive into the raw, the real, and the deeply satisfying stories of people who finally stood up and fought back. If you've ever been looked down on by someone who thought their bank account gave them the right to treat you like dirt, literally, then you are in the right place. Today's story is a masterclass in why you should never, ever poke the bear in the backcountry. Before we see this entitled neighbor's world come crashing down around him, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the saga, and ring that bell. Trust me, you're going to want to be here for every inch of this payback. To understand why this man's arrival felt like a lightning strike in a dry forest, you have to understand where we live. We're in a pocket of Arizona that most people forget exists. It's high altitude, rugged, and unforgiving. Here, the zip code isn't just an address, it's a lifestyle. We moved here in 2016, back when these 3 to 5 acre horse properties were cheap, and the only things that mattered were if your well was running and if your neighbors were the kind of people who'd pull you out of a mud bog in a monsoon. We didn't move here for a manicured lawn or a gated community aesthetic. We moved here for the messy yard harmony. Our neighborhood was a beautiful, chaotic patchwork of old trailers, sprawling workshops, and people who, like us, had a few project cars scattered around. In the city, they're called junkers. Out here, that's a 1978 Chevy that's 1 weekend away from purring again. It's scrap metal that will eventually become a gate. It's life, lived out loud and without apology. For 8 years, we lived in total peace. Our neighbors were legends, folks who didn't care if your fence was straight as long as your heart was. We had a single, lonely fence pole hammered into the dirt near our northern boundary. No survey, no lasers, just a that looks about right marker that had stood since the day we moved in. It was a gentleman's agreement etched in weathered wood. But then, the world started changing. Values quadrupled. The dirt roads we spent years learning to navigate were suddenly being scouted by people in SUVs that cost more than our first house. These were the new people, people who wanted the aesthetic of the mountains without the reality of the people who actually built the community. And then came him. He was from California, and I don't say that to be cliché, but he wore it like a badge of superiority. He didn't just buy the lot next to us. He bought it like he was a king acquiring a rebellious province. He also snatched up a tiny cabin 3 houses down to use as an income property. He wasn't a neighbor, he was an investor. The first time I saw him, he wasn't introducing himself with a plate of cookies. He was standing on the edge of his lot, arms crossed, staring at our property with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. I remember the way he looked at our scrap piles, the metal we'd spent years salvaging for projects. He didn't see potential. He saw trash. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I looked at my wife and said, "There goes the neighborhood." I didn't realize how right I was. I didn't realize that within a week this man would be standing in my driveway, his face purple with rage, threatening the very life we'd built because of a few inches of Arizona dust. The disrespect didn't start with a scream. It started with a whisper, a cowardly, anonymous whisper to the county inspectors. In a small town, secrets have the shelf life of a snowball in the Phoenix sun. Our neighbor, let's call him the investor, thought he was being clever. He thought he could move in and clean up the neighborhood by playing the system. The first sign of trouble wasn't a knock on the door. It was the sight of a white county vehicle crawling down our dirt road, stopping outside every gate, its occupants scribbling furiously on clipboards. Out here, a county inspector is about as welcome as a rattlesnake in a sleeping bag. We live here specifically to avoid the red tape of the city. The inspector visited everyone, the pig farmer to the north, the guy with the collection of vintage tractors down the road, and finally, us. We knew it was him. How? Because entitlement usually comes with a big mouth. The investor started bragging to the other neighbors, the ones he deemed acceptable, about how he was increasing property values by reporting code violations. He didn't realize that in a rural community, word travels faster than a brush fire. But then, it got personal. One evening, I was scrolling through the alerts on our security cameras. My heart skipped a beat, then began to hammer against my ribs. There, on the grainy night vision footage, was a figure. It was him. He wasn't just on the property line, he was 40 feet deep into our land. He was picking his way through our scrap metal piles like a thief in the night, his flashlight beam dancing over our disassembled cars. He was taking photos. He was documented our mess to use as ammunition. I felt a wave of heat crawl up my neck. The audacity, the sheer naked disrespect of a man who hadn't lived there for a month, trespassing on land we had tended for nearly a decade. I didn't call the police, not yet. I did what any neighbor would do. I sent him a text. Saw you on the cameras, 40 feet inside my gate. In Arizona, we take trespassing seriously. Stay off my land. His response? It wasn't an apology. It was a declaration of war. The next morning, I was outside when I heard it. That signature screech of tires. He didn't even wait to get out of the car before he started shouting. He marched up to our front yard, but he didn't stop at the gate. He leaned his weight against our no trespassing sign, the irony was apparently lost on him, and started screaming obscenities. Your junk is devaluing my investment. He yelled, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, frantic energy. And your truck. Look at it. He pointed at my old work truck. The front bumper was parked near that old permanent fence pole we'd put up years ago. That bumper is 9 inches over the line. He screamed, spit flying from his lips. 9 inches on my property. I've already called the tow company. If that eyesore isn't moved by the time I get back from lunch, it's being hauled to the impound lot. I'm tired of looking at your trash. I looked at him. I looked at his manicured hands and his designer hiking boots that had never seen mud. I felt my jaw lock so tightly it ached. I could have moved the truck. It would have taken 30 seconds. But I looked at that 9-inch gap, then back at his arrogant, sneering face. You want to talk about property lines? I said, my voice dangerously quiet. Fine, let's talk about lines. I didn't move the truck. I called a land surveyor. The next 3 days were the quietest days I've ever experienced on this mountain. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. The investor was smug. Every time he drove past our lot to check on his income property, he'd slow down, staring at my truck, which I hadn't moved an inch. He probably thought I was lazy. He probably thought he'd broken me, and that I was just waiting for the inevitable tow truck to come and haul my junk away. He had no idea that I had spent those 3 days on the phone, pulling old deeds and hiring the most meticulous, no-nonsense land surveyor in the state of Arizona. When the surveyor arrived, he was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a piece of cedar. He didn't care about investments or property values. He only cared about the math. He spent hours with his GPS equipment, his tripods, and his transit levels, cutting through the brush and referencing iron pins that hadn't been seen since the 70s. I watched from the porch, a cold beer in my hand, my heart thumping a steady rhythm of anticipation. My wife sat next to me, her eyes fixed on the surveyor as he moved closer to the disputed 9 inches. "You know," the surveyor said, wiping sweat from his brow as he walked over to me, "you guys have been living here for 8 years based on that old wooden pole, right?" "Yeah," I said, my voice steady. "Always assumed it was the edge." The surveyor looked over at the investor's lot, the lot that he was so protective of, the lot he was using to bully the neighborhood. Then he looked at his digital readout and let out a short, dry laugh. "Well," the surveyor said, pointing a calloused finger toward a spot deep into the investor's property, "if that's the edge, then that guy is in for a very, very bad day." My breath hitched. How bad? The surveyor didn't answer with words. He took a heavy mallet and a series of bright orange stakes. He walked past my truck. He walked past the 9 inches of encroachment that the investor had screamed about. He kept walking. 10 feet. 15 feet. He stopped exactly 20 feet into what the investor thought was his pristine private land. Thwack. 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 The orange stake went into the dirt. It turned out that for nearly a decade we hadn't been encroaching on him. Our temporary marker had been incredibly generous to his side of the lot. By the time the surveyor was done, the actual property line didn't just give us our 9 inches back, it swallowed a massive chunk of his investment. And then, like a scene from a movie, the white SUV appeared at the top of the hill. The investor pulled up, likely expecting to see my truck hooked up to a crane. Instead, he saw a professional surveyor in a high-visibility vest standing in the middle of what he thought was his backyard. I stood up from my porch chair. The feeling of powerlessness that had been suffocating me for weeks evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I watched him step out of the car, his face already twisting into a scowl. But as he looked at the string of orange stakes cutting a path 20 feet deep into his property, the color began to drain from his cheeks. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice losing its edge, replaced by a frantic, high-pitched quiver. "What are you doing on my land?" I took a slow sip of my beer, leaned against the porch railing, and smiled. "Funny thing about lines," I called out. "They aren't always where you want them to be. You wanted to be a stickler for the rules? Well, the rules just cost you 20 feet. The investor stood there, frozen. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. It was as if his entire reality, the one where he was the wealthy savior of a trashy neighborhood, was dissolving right under his designer boots. He looked at the orange stakes, then at the surveyor, then back at me. His hands were shaking. I could see the exact moment the math started working in his head. 20 feet across the entire length of a 5-acre lot isn't just a strip of dirt. In a neighborhood of this scale, that's thousands of square feet. That's the space he planned for his paved driveway. That's the buffer he wanted between him and our junk. This is impossible, he finally choked out. The deed says, the listing said. The surveyor didn't even look up from his clipboard. Listings are marketing, pal. Math is reality. Your iron pins were buried under a foot of wash out from the last monsoon. My GPs is tied to the county benchmark. This is the line. If anything, these folks have been doing you a favor for 8 years by letting you think you owned this. I walked down the porch steps, slow and deliberate. Every step felt like a victory lap. I stopped at the old wooden fence pole, the one he'd screamed about. "You remember this pole?" I asked, my voice echoing in the sudden stillness of the afternoon. "You called it an eyesore. You said my truck was 9 inches over. You were so worried about those 9 inches that you didn't stop to think that maybe, just maybe, the locals knew something you didn't." He turned on me, his face shifting from shock to a desperate, ugly kind of rage. "I'll sue. I'll have this contested. You can't just move a property line." "I didn't move it," I replied, pointing to the surveyor's official seal. He found it. And since you're so fond of calling the county and following the letter of the law, I'm sure you'll have no problem with what happens next. I let that hang in the air for a moment. I wanted him to feel the weight of his own tactics. But the nightmare was only beginning for him. Because out here, word travels. And remember the pig farmer on the other side of his lot? The one he'd been harassing and trying to get a restraining order against? Well, she had been watching from her fence line, a grin spreading across her weathered face. She shouted over the wind, "Hey, Mr. Investor, if his line moved 20 feet that way, you might want to check the line on my side, because my shed has been sitting right there for 15 years, and I think you just became my landlord, or I just became the owner of your backyard." The investor looked like he was going to have a stroke. In Arizona, we have adverse possession laws. If someone uses a piece of land openly and notoriously for long enough, it can become theirs. By forcing a formal survey, he hadn't just opened a door, he'd triggered a land grab landslide. He didn't go to lunch. He got into his SUV and sped off, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust that choked the very air he thought he was too good to breathe. But we weren't done. Oh, no. The ugly part was just getting started. The following week was a flurry of activity. My neighbor, the investor, had vanished. His white SUV was nowhere to be seen, but the silence he left behind wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a man meeting with lawyers and realizing he'd stepped into a bear trap of his own making. I didn't wait for him to process his grief. I went to the local hardware store and bought the most industrial, utilitarian fencing materials I could find. We weren't building a pretty fence. We weren't building a fence that matched his vision of a luxury mountain retreat. We were building a monument to his own arrogance. As I hammered the new posts into the actual property line, 20 feet deep into what he thought was his land, I felt a sense of rhythmic justice with every strike of the mallet. Thud. That's for the tow truck threat. Thud. That's for trespassing on my cameras. Thud. That's for calling the county on people who were here long before you. But the real kicker, the pig farmer to his north. Inspired by the survey, she had gone to the county records too. It turned out her shed, a sturdy, weathered structure she'd used for 15 years, was now legally sitting on a chunk of land that he had paid for, but she had possessed. Under Arizona's adverse possession laws, she didn't just have a dispute, she had a claim. He wasn't just losing 20 feet on our side, he was looking at a total legal nightmare on the other. He had bought a lot, but he was ending up with a sliver. Then came the day he finally returned. He drove up the road, but he didn't screech his tires this time. He slowed to a crawl as he saw it, the ugly fence. It was a jagged line of galvanized steel and wire, cutting right through the middle of the area he had cleared for his grand entrance. It made his little cabin look like it was shoved into a corner, trapped between a scrapyard and a pig farm that now legally owned a piece of his dirt. He got out of his car, but he didn't scream. He looked broken. The arrogance had been drained out of him, replaced by the hollow stare of a man who realized he'd spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to become the most hated man in a 5-mile radius. You're really putting it right there?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't stop digging. I didn't even look up. "This is the line, right? I'm just following the rules, just like you wanted. 9 inches was a big deal to you. I figured 20 feet would be a dream come true." He stood there for a long time, watching us work. He looked at the pig farmer, who was leaning against her fence, waving a mocking hand at him. He looked at the orange stakes that had redefined his life. Within a month, a for sale sign went up on his lot. But here's the thing about investing in a rural neighborhood after you've alienated everyone. Word gets around. Potential buyers would stop by, and they'd see the ugly fence. They'd hear the pigs. They'd see the scrap metal, and most importantly, they'd talk to us. We'd kindly let them know exactly where the property lines were, and exactly what kind of harmony we expected from our neighbors. He ended up selling that lot at a massive loss. He didn't just lose 20 feet of dirt, he lost his shirt, his ego, and his income property dream. He retreated back to the city, probably telling stories about the crazy hillbillies who ruined his investment. But out here on the mountain, the air is a little clearer now. My truck is parked exactly where it's always been, only now it has 20 feet of breathing room. The day he packed up his SUV for the last time, I happened to be out by the fence line. He had to drive past me to leave. He stopped for just a second, his window rolling down. He looked at the fence, then at me. "I hope you're happy," he spat, one last flicker of that old bitterness rising up. "You ruined this place for me." I smiled, tipped my cap, and said, "No, friend. You ruined it for yourself the moment you decided that 9 inches of dirt was worth more than a good neighbor. Next time you move somewhere, try bringing a handshake instead of a measuring tape." He peeled out, his tires spinning in the Arizona dust, disappearing into the horizon. He was gone. And as the dust settled, the pig farmer walked over, handed me a cold drink, and we both looked out over the new boundary. The ugly fence looked beautiful to me. It wasn't just metal and wire. It was a boundary that said, "Respect is earned, not bought." Months passed. The for sale sign on his lot was starting to lean, bleached by the relentless Arizona sun. The investment that was supposed to be his crown jewel had become a haunting reminder of a war he couldn't win. One evening, as the sun was dipping below the mountains, painting the sky in bruised purples and burnt oranges, I was out by the boundary line. I heard a vehicle approach. It was the white SUV. But this time, there was no screech of tires, no aggressive cloud of dust. It pulled up slowly, almost hesitantly. He stepped out, but the man I saw wasn't the arrogant investor from California. His shoulders were slumped, and the fiery entitlement in his eyes had been replaced by a weary, hollow look. He walked up to the ugly fence, the barrier I had built to spite him, and stood there for a long time. "Hey," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. It was raspy, stripped of its sharp edge. "I'm leaving. I closed the deal to sell the lot today. I'm heading back, but I couldn't leave without saying something." I stopped what I was doing, leaning on my shovel, watching him. I didn't say a word. I let the silence do the talking. "I was wrong," he finally blurted out. He looked down at his boots, now covered in the very dust he used to despise. "I came here thinking my money and my city rules made me better than everyone else. I looked at your home, your life, and I called it trash because it didn't fit into my spreadsheet. I fought you over 9 inches of dirt because of my own ego. And in the end, that ego cost me everything." He looked up at me, and for the first time, I didn't see an antagonist. I saw a man who had been humbled by his own reflection. "I didn't come here to be a neighbor. I came here to be a landlord. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry for how I treated you and this community." The air between us changed. The heat of the revenge I'd been nursing for months, the satisfaction of taking his land, suddenly felt heavy. Revenge is a powerful drug, but it's a lonely one. Looking at him, I realized that I had already won. I didn't need his land to prove my point. I took a long breath, feeling the tension leave my chest. I reached out and began unhooking the tension wires on the new fence line. "You know," I said quietly, "Arizona dirt is hard, but it's not as hard as a man's heart. You're right, you were a terrible neighbor. But you're being a decent man right now." I looked at the orange stakes that marked the 20-foot gain. "I'm not moving the fence today. But I'll tell the new owners that we're going back to the old line. I don't need your 20 feet. I just needed you to realize that out here, we value people over property lines." I extended my hand across the fence. He looked at it, stunned, before reaching out and shaking it with a firm, trembling grip. "Go start fresh somewhere else," I told him. "And remember, you can buy a lot, but you have to earn a home." He nodded, got back into his car, and drove away. This time, there was no bitterness left in the dust. He left as a man who had learned the most expensive lesson of his life, and I stayed as a man who learned that the ultimate power move isn't taking what you can, it's having the strength to give it back. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I've found that mercy is the only thing that actually clears the air. We could have kept that land. We could have made his life a legal hell for years. But in the end, we chose peace. Because at the end of the day, a fence only protects your land, but your character protects your soul. If this ending touched you, or if you believe that sometimes a sincere apology is worth more than 20 feet of land, drop the word mercy in the comments. It takes a big person to stand up to a bully, but it takes an even bigger person to forgive one. Thank you for riding along with us today on Saga of Hearts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. We've got more incredible stories of justice and redemption coming your way next week.